The Second Anglo-Boer War, or more specifically, the Second War for Independence, would never have been fought if the biggest gold deposit that this world has ever known had not been discovered in the middle of the old Transvaal Republic here in South Africa. Along this ridge of land, whose center was to be named Johannesburg. And that is the fundamental, damnable truth across which this story of suffering and heroism grew.
As the century drew to a close, the age of English imperialism was at its height. The Queen Empress had long since celebrated her Diamond Jubilee and had bowed out of public life. In the village of St. Eve, in the county of Cornwall, was a woman named Emily Hobhouse. Emily's father was Archdeacon of Bodmin, and here Emily and her family lived far removed from the hardship and poverty of the mining community of Cornwall. In this little church opposite the rectory, the Archdeacon attempted to communicate with his parishioners. The Hobhouse family was wealthy and well-connected, and Emily watched with growing concern the conflict developing between Imperial Britain and the Transvaal Republic with its newly found wealth of gold.
Tragically, here in England, the great liberal spirit of William Ewart Gladstone was fast fading. And the new materialistic imperialists, represented by Britain's colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, was in the ascendancy. Yes, the British were pushing for control of the Transvaal Republic, and thereby the gold fields.
Finally, the patriarchal president of the Transvaal Republic, Paul Creer, squared up to the entire British Empire. And there, in the Volksraad, the Boer Parliament, he made his statement. The republics are determined, if they must belong to England, that a price will have to be paid which will stagger humanity.
Joseph Chamberlain, popularly known as Pushful Joe, was apparently not alarmed. He even eagerly accepted his imperial responsibility in the looming war. He said, "It is a feather in my cap." On October the 11th, 1899, the two Boer republics, knowing that there was no hope for peace, invaded the British colonies of the Cape and Natal, and by December, the Boers, the fighting farmers, were inflicting severe defeats upon the British imperial troops from one end of southern Africa to the other. But this military pattern could not last. The Boers were numerically a small nation. They could never muster more than 45,000 men, and against them were arriving massive British reinforcements from Britain, India, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. From February 1900 onwards, the Boers were pushed northward by this overwhelming weight, and so from that time, the Boers, under Commandant General Louis Botha, began to fight their famous guerrilla war. The Boers ceased to fight in the conventional manner and roamed their countries in mounted groups under such leaders as Generals De la Rey, Christian de Wet, Jan Smuts, and of course, Louis Botha.
And at this game, men fighting on their own land and for their own land, the British could not defeat them, at least by force of arms. And this reality began to enter the mind of Lord Roberts. He issued a proclamation to the Boer people, which carried a first hint of sinister and inevitable implications.
I warn all burghers to desist from any further hostility towards Her Majesty's government. And those burghers who continue to furnish the enemy with supplies or information will be dealt with according to the usages of war.
Considering those words, we must remember that they were addressed to the families of the men who were out fighting in their own country and for their own country.
The British Imperial troops were about to perpetrate against the two Boer republics a scorched earth policy which was to be near total in its destruction. Indeed, as early as January 1900, the Reuters news agency had telegraphed back to Europe. The British force came upon 3 Boer farmsteads, and these they destroyed with dynamite and fire. This was a murmuring overture which was to build to a dulling crescendo over the following 2 years.
President Creer addressed his objection to Lord Roberts. We learn from many sides that British troops, contrary to the recognized usages of war, are guilty of the destruction with fire and blowing up with dynamite of farmhouses, of the devastation of farms and goods therein, whereby unprotected women and children are often deprived of food and cover.
Lord Roberts replied to this warning from the battlefield of Paardeberg.
February the 24th, 1900. I am fully convinced that no willful destruction of property by Her Majesty's forces has taken place, except such as was absolutely necessary for military purposes.
There was the rub. What exactly was to become absolutely necessary for military purposes? The answer to that question was to become a nightmare. The British military machine wished to keep the destruction of farms and villages a secret. But this was an impossible conspiracy.
Shocked British soldiers began to write home, and some international newspaper war correspondents managed to avoid the British censor. A typical account was printed in Britain in the Morning Leader. The Guards Brigade are marching in, burning practically everything on the road. I hear today that General Rundle has burnt his way up to the village of De Wetstorp. The London Daily Chronicle printed on May the 28th, 1900, from end to end, the Orange River Colony, as the British call the Orange Free State, now lies ruined and starving. Oh yes, that British campaign far away down in southern Africa was growing extremely ugly.
When Miss Hobhouse first learnt what the British Army was perpetrating in southern Africa, she was 39 years old. Emily Hobhouse decisively put aside the political questions between her country, Britain, and the Boer republics. Not that she didn't know or judge, but wisely and instinctively she focused on one awful question. What is happening to the women and children now that their two countries are being devastated and burnt? And so Emily left her genteel, privileged environment and stomped from one end of Great Britain to the other, speaking her mind very loudly and very clearly.
Of course, she was not alone. There were other high-principled Britishers, but for anyone who said one word on behalf of the Boer people, albeit Boer women and children, Britain had become a vindictive jungle.
Emily eventually was advertised to speak at a meeting here in her home county of Cornwall.
The Cornish Times reported the historic occasion. Mr. Quiller Couch, the well-known novelist, presided.
The speakers will be Miss Emily Hobhouse and Mr. David Lloyd George.
Mr. David Lloyd George, the radical member of Parliament for Carnarvon.
We don't want your mates. Let's go on, bloody well.
Mr. Lloyd George was unable even to utter a word. And after a scene of uproar and confusion unparalleled in Liskeard, the platform was stormed by a party of young fellows, many of whom bore miniature Union Jacks, and the meeting was broken up in confusion. At this point, somebody started singing "Soldiers of the Queen."
Oh, we're soldiers of the Queen, me lads, the Queen, me lads. Come on now, all together, lads. Oh, we're soldiers of the Queen, me lads, the Queen, me lads, the Queen, me lads. Oh, we're soldiers of the Queen, me lads.
And the song was continued to the accompaniment of stamping feet, whistles, catcalls, and other noises.
Come on now, lads, all together.
Cheers were then given for some of the British generals in South Africa.
Three cheers for Bobs.
With hoots for Kruger.
And the Boers.
And further cheers.
Three cheers for Lord Roberts. And Boer. And Kruger beat the bloody lot. Down with Kruger. Come on, lads.
Sheer fatigue alone put a stop to the singing for a time. Taking advantage of the lull, the chairman continued.
Let me assure you that we are all good patriots here.
But was interrupted by someone shouting,
Give somebody else a chance, sir. And I suggest Miss Hobhouse. After all, she is local. Lloyd George is damn radical. Now, please give Miss Emily Hobhouse a hearing.
We don't want to hurt. Let's hear what you got to say, Miss Hobhouse.
She, having been standing a mute spectator of the scene for some minutes, the disorder having decreased somewhat, Miss Hobhouse said,
I think you'll agree with me that if Her Gracious Majesty the Queen, to whom you have just sung, were present here now, she would be heartily ashamed of her Cornish subjects.
Bloody rubbish! We're bloody ashamed of you! Send her back to Cruiser Land!
I have a great deal that I'm anxious to say to you.
And I've got a good deal to say to you, too. We don't want any of our trouble here. We're thrown.
Will you not sit down for a few minutes?
Bloody woman!
It seems to me a strange thing that Cornish men will not listen to a Cornish woman. This kind of behavior will do more to advance our humane cause than the most eloquent speeches we could deliver.
chairs were thrown all over the place, and several blows were struck. At that point, the police made their appearance on the platform, and the conflict at once ceased. Miss Hobhouse with Mr. Quillacooch and Mr. David Lloyd George were then persuaded to leave the hall.
Emily Hobhouse had failed with words to convince her British compatriots that they should concern themselves with the innocent sufferings of women and children in South Africa. And now, her unstoppable mind began to veer towards more direct action. First, she founded a charity called the South African Women and Children's Distress Fund. And then she bought a second-class passage to Cape Town, South Africa, out of her own not wealthy pocket, sailing on December the 7th, 1900. Now, she would see for herself what was happening to the women and the children. And she collected £300 to spend on them, where most it might be needed. No, it would not prove enough.
During the voyage, Emily Hobhouse studied South African history, and she studied the Dutch language, which the Boer people spoke.
When Emily arrived here in Cape Town, the war was fast deteriorating into one of desperate attrition. And it was here that she heard, for the first time, that the British were forming many camps up northward to hold the Boer women and children whose farms and villages had been burnt. And here in Cape Town, she saw messages reporting the awful events.
It is rumored here in this vicinity of Bloemfontein that strong punitive measures have been taken at Bothaville, a Boer village, and that the Dutch church is the only building left standing there.
Reuters news agency, Kroonstad, October 26, 1900.
The British military column arrived at noon, destroying farms on its way. Not a single Boer home in the country between Dundee in Natal and Vryheid in the Transvaal has been left standing. All have been burned by the British troops.
Bloemfontein, November 5th, 1900.
It is stated that the village of Ventersburg has met with a fate similar to that of Bothaville, having been destroyed on account of its having been used as a Boer depot.
And then Emily began to learn of awful facts from British soldiers. A Lieutenant Morrison stated,
The British Provost Marshal came up from the main body of troops, removed the Boer women and children with their bedding, and then proceeded to burn or blow up the houses. From that time on, Our progress was like the old-time forages in the highlands of Scotland 2 centuries ago. We moved on from valley to valley, burning, looting, and turning out women and children to sit beside the ruins of their once beautiful farm estates. It was a terrible thing to see. And I don't know that I want to see another trip of the sort. We burned a track about 6 miles wide through these fertile valleys and completely destroyed the village of Villeport and the town of Dulston.
And a Captain March Phillips of the British Army stated,
"Oh, farm burning goes merrily on, and our course through the country is marked as in prehistoric ages, by pillars of smoke by day and fire by night. We usually burn from 6 to a dozen farms a day. I do not gather that any special reason or cause is alleged or proved against the farms burnt. If the Boers have used the farms, or the owner is on commando, or if the railway line within a certain distance has been blown up, or even if there are Boers in the neighborhood who persist in fighting. These are some of the reasons. The men belonging to the farms are always away fighting with the Boer army, and only women are left. Of these women, there are often 3 or even 4 generations, grandmother, mother, and family of girls. The boys, over 13 years, are usually away fighting with their papas. The girls and children huddle around in their cotton frocks, while our men set fire to the farms. Sometimes the women entreat that their homes may be spared, and once or twice, in an agony of rage, they invoke curses on our heads. But that is quite the exception. As a rule, they make no sign.
oh yes, Emily's worst fears were very fulfilled. £300 she now knew would not be enough. Not even £3 million would be enough. And so, carrying letters of introduction, she lunched with High Commissioner Sir Alfred Milner himself, here at Government House in Cape Town. He was also an uneasy bachelor.
Well, Miss Hobhouse, let us discuss the predicament of the Boer women and children.
Sir Alfred, I would prefer to discuss that complicated subject when we are alone.
Oh. Well, perhaps I can manage 15 minutes afterwards in the withdrawing.
Now, Sir Alfred, what are we going to do about the farm burning and the inevitable suffering? Sir Alfred, one of the matters that worries me, as a patriotic British woman, is that we are fast turning the Boer women into martyrs. And we are creating such a deep resentment against us British that it'll take years to eradicate.
Yes.
Sir Alfred, You must be deeply aware of the distressing reports that Reuters and the Central News Agency and others are dispatching.
Yes.
To England?
Indeed.
Printed in the Times?
Yes.
In full?
Indeed.
And I understand that virtually all the nations of Europe are reveling in what they refer to as our British disgrace.
It's... farm burning is a questionable method.
I think, Sir Alfred, that it would demonstrate to the world at large that we do care about the suffering of innocent parties if you, Sir Alfred, were to arrange for me to visit the refugee camps, which I believe are being set up.
Oh, yes. Yes, dear lady, you are right. I will communicate immediately with Lord Kitchener. The military must approve. But I am sure that his lordship will see the wisdom of your venture. And the humanity.
Thank you, Sir Alfred. Thank you.
The interview had lasted not 15 minutes, but 1 hour.
However, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, who was now the Commander-in-Chief, was not such a pushover as Sir Alfred Milner. Kitchener balked.
Miss Emily Hobhouse may visit as far north as Bloemfontein, but no further. And I hope that this will be clearly understood.
Further north than Bloemfontein, the countries were beginning to look like hell. Authorities here in Cape Town placed a 12-ton railway wagon at Emily's disposal, and she, having blown her 300 pounds on food supplies, clothes and bedding, set off northwards into Africa, taking also for her personal comfort a kettle lamp, some bread, some butter, some apricot jam, tea and cocoa.
The train carrying Emily trundled over the great, apparently empty highland called the Karoo. It stopped frequently, and everywhere were British Tommies. Emily must have looked an odd sight at the occasional wayside station, the determined English spinster.
She began to see the occasional isolated burnt-out farmhouse, the carcasses of dead cattle and horses. British Tommies begged for newspapers. She gave them what she had, and all of her novels.
Hey, let me say that.
Soon after arriving in Bloemfontein, Emily was approached by a distinguished Boer lady, a Mrs. Feckhardt, who, knowing of Emily's purpose, invited her to stay in her home. Then, Emily presented herself before the British military governor for the whole Orange Free State.
A general pretty man. He was most gallant and gave her a permanent pass to the refugee camp. And your suggestions will be carefully considered. And I will be glad to hear what you think of the camp.
Oh, thank you, General.
I had hoped that you would stay here at Government House, but unfortunately we are in the midst of a bout of typhoid, and the place is overrun. As you can see with doctors and
Oh, well, don't worry yourself, General. I am most fortunate in being the guest of Mrs. Fickard.
Not surely the Mrs. A. Fickard?
Yes?
Oh, dear lady. But she is very bitter against us British.
Just so, General. But my visit may have a softening effect on her.
Mrs. Fickard. Oh, I hope you were right, Miss Hobhouse. Please.
And then Emily set off for the Bloemfontein refugee camp outside of the simple capital, carrying with her a selection of supplies and, for protection from the African sun, a parasol.
The sights that greeted her were far worse than she had bargained for. She had presumed that the British authorities would have provided the women and children with the essentials for human survival. She would merely work to provide the basic extras. But the women and children were desperately short of water, almost bereft of any fuel, and generally totally uncared for. There were about 2,000 human beings living in tents, sleeping on the uncovered earth, even expectant mothers and children.
As she stood in one of those tents, a lethal puff-adder appeared from under the canvas. She gave the deadly snake a solid whack with her English lady's parasol. Now she had seen for herself, and quite a few other creatures, human, were about to receive a whack from her till they learned to mend their ways. Indeed, at that time, here in Bloemfontein, Emily declared a second war in South Africa between her maiden self and the Tory government back in England that didn't want to know about innocent suffering while they were engaged in conquest for power and gold.
Emily listened to the endless tragedies.
My husband and 3 sons left me to fight the English in October 1899. My eldest boy, 21 years, was killed in January. How I felt the hand of cruel war. Yet not once have I regretted that he went to fight for his dear country. Yes, for his own country, bought with the blood of forefathers, which the cruel English money seekers want to take from us. The Boer women in the camps were also getting angry at the guilty mendacity of the British authorities. One woman, a Mrs. Moll, stated, "The British say we asked them for protection, which is a falsehood. We never did anything of the kind." Then she set about doing what she could for the hard-pressed women and children. Methodically, she handed out her supplies of food and clothes. She threatened the British authorities that if they did not act compassionately for their victims, she would hold them personally and publicly responsible for the deaths that were happening all around her.
The military governor, General Prettyman, anxiously provided Emily with a bucket for each tent in the camp. Unbelievably, that was a big step forward. And she insisted that he issued a proclamation stating that all drinking water must be boiled, and therefore he had to produce fuel to carry out that job.
General Prettyman was beginning to capitulate completely under Emily's onslaught, or as far as he was able, he ordered a British military captain to be at Emily's disposal to carry out whatever she thought should be done. Prettyman made some money available, and finally he asked Emily,
"Perhaps you would give me a shopping list of your requirements, dear lady."
Oh, certainly. A wash house with running water and soap, forage for cows, medical supplies, and trained nurses.
Emily personally acquired mattresses and sacking, and she produced an engine boiler big enough to hold all of the drinking water.
Now Emily's parasol was truly gone, and her Victorian sleeves were rolled up. What a strange image she was. A lone Englishwoman representing the virtues of her nation, surrounded by the evil that same nation had created. Of course, saints are rare enough anywhere, amongst any people.
Emily never showed her distress to the suffering victims, but to a friend she stated,
"It was so pathetic. They think I came from England with magic powers to set them free. It's dreadful to explain. There's no chance for that."
and she wrote a letter.
I call this camp system wholesale cruelty. It can never be wiped out from the memories of the people. It presses hardest on the children. If only the English people would try to exercise a little imagination and picture the whole miserable scene. Entire villages and districts rooted up and dumped in a strange, bare place. To keep these camps going is murder for the children.
All around her was death. She reported,
Next, I was called to see a woman panting in the heat, just sickening for a confinement. Next tent, a little 6-month-old baby gasping its life out on its mother's knee. 2 or 3 others drooping and sick in that tent. Next, a girl of 24 lay dying on a stretcher. Her father, a big, gentle Boer, kneeling beside her, while in the next tent, his wife was watching a child of 6, also dying. I can't describe what it is like to see these children lying about in a state of collapse. It's just exactly like faded flowers thrown away. And then Emily decided to visit refugee camps south of Bloemfontein, she being refused permission to travel north by Lord Kitchener himself. She traveled without the aid of the military. Indeed, now that her compassion for the Boer people was beginning to make itself known, the British military were already beginning to look on her as a kind of a pariah. But she didn't lose her sense of humor. As she traveled, she wrote, I should do much better here if I was shaped like a truck and ran on wheels.
Springfontein camp was even worse. Destitution and death. Emily made the truth quite clear. She stated,
It is hollow and rotten to the heart's core to have made all over the state large, uncomfortable communities of people whom you call refugees and say you are protecting, but who call themselves prisoners of war, women and children, compulsorily detained and detesting your protection. Traveling for this Victorian rector's daughter was now extremely tough. Occasionally, she was able to undress at night and sleep in the guard's van of a train. But her face was indomitable. Only once did her deep feminine sensitivity get the better of her Cornish stoicism. One night, a railway station officer offered her his bath and his bed, while he, the good gentleman, slept in a railway van. Emily has confessed that she burst into tears. No doubt later and in total privacy.
Miss Hobhouse did not confine all of her love to the Boer people. She related how one day a British Tommy came to her door.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Can you spare a drop of boiled water?
And where are you from, young man?
Oh, I used to live in Somerset.
Oh, fancy that. I'm from Cornwall. We're neighbors.
I don't often miss Somerset. If I'd known what I know now, I'd never have gone to war. I'll never go to war again.
Would you like to share my cocoa?
Oh, that would be a treat. I've been in hospital, and now I'm sleeping in 6 inches of water.
Drink up your cocoa.
Thank you. I'll never go to war again.
Drink it up.
Emily now decided that she must return to Cape Town to seek permission to visit the refugee camps, which were now being called concentration camps, northward at Kroonstad and Mafeking.
But here in Cape Town, an organization calling itself the Guild of Loyal Women, expatriate British women, were working hard against her. And they reported their opinion to, amongst others, the governor.
Emily Hobhouse has sown discontent and dissatisfaction among the Boer women. These Boer women were all satisfied and indeed grateful to the English government until she came amongst them and taught them to invent grievances where none existed.
At the time of this English female statement, the mortality figures in the British concentration camps had been officially accepted as
The October mortality in the concentration camps has reached 346.72 per 1,000 for the aggregate.
And over here in Britain, the whole bitter truth was beginning to seep through. The British Army had virtually overrun both of the Boer republics in the conventional military sense. But we British were far, far from victory and peace. Probably about 25,000 mounted Boers were still raiding and ambushing the vast British army very efficiently all over southern Africa. And that dilemma was sucking the British further and further into nightmarish reprisals. Here in England, there was an uneasy mixture of jingoistic shouting on the one hand and expressions of self-loathing on the other. The problem was the Boers would simply not stop fighting.
The Commandant General of the Transvaal, Louis Botha, had explained the Boers' reason for continuing the fight very clearly to the British Commander-in-Chief.
I can only protest against your measures as being in opposition to all principles of civilized warfare and excessively cruel towards the women and children. But I desire to give you the assurance that nothing you may do against the women and children will deter us from continuing the struggle for our independence.
And Emily Hobhouse, as an English person, was now very much on her own amongst her own people. The Lieutenant Governor of what had been the Orange Free State, a certain Major Sir Hamilton Gould Adams, confronted our heroine.
Miss Hobhouse, it has been reported to me that you have shown personal sympathy with the Boers when doling out clothes and food.
But that is precisely what I came to do. To give personal sympathy and help in personal troubles.
Nevertheless, Emily managed to wheedle permission to visit the concentration camp at Mafeking.
However, the British governor at the Cape wrote ominously to his boss in England, Joseph Chamberlain.
Miss Hobhouse exercises a bad influence on the Boer women. In the refugee camps.
Oh, dear. The British were quietly preparing the crucifixion of Miss Hobhouse. And she, after her work at Mafeking and being allowed to go no further, decided, innocently, to return to Britain to rouse her nation to remorse of many, many horrific facts.
On arrival in London, Emily went to see the Tory Secretary of State for War, St. John Broderick, at the War Office.
Mr. Broderick had recently chanced his temerity by standing up in the House of Commons and quoting Lord Kitchener in South Africa.
He categorically states, quote, "The Boer women and children in the concentration camps have a sufficient allowance and are all comfortable and happy," unquote.
Mr. Broderick no doubt hoped and prayed that he could keep Emily's mouth shut.
Emily asked the Secretary of War for humane improvements to the camps. Broderick, like the slippery politician he was, more or less agreed.
If there is no objection from the military, naturally.
And the military, of course, now meant brutal Kitchener. Emily walked out of the War Office 2 hours later, and sensing what she was up against, she began to bombard every member of the Houses of Parliament with her terrible facts.
A few brave allies stood by her side. A remarkable proportion of them were Celts. Indeed, Emily herself stated,
I am a Celt, and therefore am also a member of an oppressed race.
The Welsh Celt, David Lloyd George, reminded Joseph Chamberlain,
The Herod of old sought to crush a little race, the Jewish people, by killing all the young children. It was not a success, and I would commend that story to Herod's modern imitator. And then the Irish Celt, in the person of John Dillon, stood up in the House of Commons and addressed Queen Victoria herself. We humbly represent to Her Majesty that the wholesale burning of farmhouses, the driving of women and children out of their homes without shelter or proper provision of food, and the confinement of those women and children in prison camps are practices
not in accordance with the usages of war, as recognized by civilized nations, that such proceedings are in the highest degree disgraceful and dishonoring to a nation professing to be Christian. But then, of course, the Irishman Dillon was deeply aware of the exploitation and often brutality by the English in his own country, Ireland, for over 700 dreadful years. One really can't complain about him being so outspoken. And finally, the normally docile Scotsman, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, leader of the Liberal Party, spoke the hard truth. Chamberlain and company were beginning to wobble and were bleating as an excuse, well, war is war. Campbell Bannerman stated, a phrase often used now is, war is war. But when one comes to ask about it, one is told that no war is going on in South Africa, that it is not a real war. When is a war not a war? I say, when it is carried on by methods of barbarism in South Africa.
Shame on you, sir! Shame on you!
Bannerman's words, methods of barbarism, rang around a shocked world. Non-British nations put their diplomacy aside and openly expressed their abhorrence. Not always, of course, without monumental hypocrisy. But it was a bad international press for Britain.
Emily Hobhouse was now a marked woman in Britain. She had published her opinions, and the London Times, the thunderer, moved ponderously to attack her and what she stood for. An editorial read,
Miss Hobhouse's pamphlet is a weapon of party warfare. It's been used as such a weapon wherever the name of England is hated. Even in the dynamite press of America.
Emily travelled all over Britain fighting her cause. Daily she was attacked. Everywhere she was called a traitor to her nation. But Lloyd George asked,
is every person who opposes a war during its progress of necessity a traitor? If so, the great Lord Chatham was a traitor. And Burke and Fox especially. And in later times, Cobden and Bright. All of these truly great men were traitors.
Emily never lost her guard in front of her British enemies, but she privately confessed to the wife of President Steyn in South Africa. My work for the camps in South Africa has brought nearly all my own people to look on me with contempt and suspicion. The press has singled me out, and I am branded a rebel, a liar, and an enemy of my own people. This has done much to sour my life. I'm banned from society. People turn away when my name is mentioned. However, Emily was indestructible. She again went to see Mr. Broderick at the War Office. Sir, I wish to go back to the concentration camps in South Africa.
I am afraid that is now impossible, Miss Hobhouse.
Oh? May I know the government's reasons for this refusal?
Well, we have selected a committee of ladies to inspect the concentration camps, and they should be, as far as is possible, removed from any suspicion of partiality. Now, it would be impossible for the government to accept your services in South Africa because your reports and speeches have been made the subject of so much controversy.
Emily wrote a letter to Broderick. The repulse to myself would have mattered nothing had only a large band of kindly workers been instantly dispatched. Instead, a whole month passed while 6 ladies were chosen. During that month, 576 children died. The preparation and journey of these ladies occupied yet another month, and in that interval, 1,124 more children succumbed. Instead of at once proceeding to the great centers of high mortality, yet a 3rd month seems to have been spent in their journey to Mafeking. And in that month, 1,546 more children died. In the name of the children whom I have watched suffer and die, I make bold to plead with you once again. I urge that immediate steps be taken to act, lest one day we be bowed down by the humiliating and grievous thought that we have sat still and watched calmly the extermination of a race brave and strong enough to have held the British Empire at bay for 2 long years.
But nothing was doing. The committee of English ladies made their progress through the concentration camps of South Africa, and though there were 2 distinguished feminists amongst them, they were all proven backers of the British establishment when it came to conquering the 2 Boer republics.
And what of Emily? Well, she simply booked an independent passage on the Avondale Castle, sailing for South Africa, under her own steam, as it were. The Avondale Castle arrived in Cape Town on October the 27th, 1901. As Emily was preparing to land, a Royal Navy lieutenant named Lingham came on board.
He announced that he had to speak to Miss Hobhouse, excuse me, and this strange interview took place. Lieutenant Lingham said,
I have to inform you, Miss Hobhouse, that you are to remain on the Avondale Castle under strict supervision, and that you are to hold no communication with anybody ashore, either by word or letter, and that it is proposed that you should leave for Britain on the ship leaving on Wednesday afternoon. You, sir, will be held responsible under martial law for guarding Miss Hobhouse, and you are not to allow her to leave the ship.
And who, Mr. Lingham, has issued these orders?
Colonel Cooper, acting commandant in Cape Town.
And from whom has Colonel Cooper had his orders?
Of that
I can say nothing.
Mr. Lingham, when I left England, there was no martial law in Cape Town. And it seems incredible to me that after so long a voyage, I'm not even allowed to land. Maybe I could land elsewhere in South Africa?
No, madam.
Have you brought any charge against me?
No, madam.
Have you a warrant?
No, Miss Hobhouse.
Then all I can do is write to your Colonel Cooper. Will you carry it to him?
Yes, madam.
Thank you.
And Emily addressed the colonel.
I could understand the rigors of martial law being applied to me if I had in the past taken, or even now intended to take, a political part of any kind. But this I have never done. Both in South Africa and in England, my words and my work have been purely and consistently philanthropic in character. I have left politics severely alone. And my intentions in revisiting South Africa were simply to carry on this philanthropic work.
And then Emily, knowing that all-powerful Kitchener was at the root of her predicament, began to play every feminine card she could muster.
I do not feel equal to the strain of an immediate return voyage which you offer me, nor the alternate of remaining a prisoner on board the Avondale Castle. I enclose a letter which I earnestly ask you to convey to the Governor, Healy Hutchinson, and also one to Lord Milner and one to Lord Kitchener. It cannot but seem to me that the summary arrest of an English woman bound on works of charity without warrant of any kind or stated offense is a procedure that requires explanation. I am, sir, yours faithfully, Emily Hobhouse.
Then Colonel Cooper called at the ship to see Emily.
Do you not think that it would be best, Miss Hobhouse, to leave quietly by the ship which is sailing for Britain this afternoon?
I am not equal to it and need rest.
What then are your plans?
My plans are to go ashore and do my work. However, under the circumstances, I shall await replies to my letters from the Lords Milner and Kitchener, whom I hope are unaware of my arrest. However, rest assured that if it would add to the honor or to the safety of England that I should be imprisoned, I am willing. I ask only that it might be in a land prison.
A telegram arrived from Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. Emily, having a fair idea what it contained, murmured,
I am too unwell to read or take in the contents of this message.
Young Lieutenant Lingham, who was present, read it.
in agreement with a recommendation made by Lord Milner, Emily Hobhouse is ordered for immediate deportation. Kitchener.
I am not strong enough to entertain the idea.
Miss Hobhouse, you will have to leave on the ship which is sailing for England this afternoon. Otherwise, I am ordered to use force.
I cannot help what you do. That is your affair. I can only judge what is right for myself to do. Why don't you take me on shore and hang me? Why torment me so? However, I still have faith enough in English men and English officers to believe that they will not force a sick woman on a long journey against her will. And I shall retain that faith for as long as possible.
2 British soldiers were then led in, led by a military doctor who said,
"Will you yield of your own free will? Otherwise, here are the soldiers."
I will not take one step voluntarily towards that ship.
Madam, do you want to be taken like a lunatic?
Sir, the lunacy is on your side, and with those whose commands you obey. If you had any manhood in you, you would go and leave me alone. Please, please, afford me the same respect you would like shown to your wives and mothers under similar conditions. Please.
But Emily Hobhouse was carried physically on board the departing ship which duly sailed for England.
In Britain, Emily joined her very brave Liberal friends, and they continued to blast against the wholesale murder in South Africa.
And the creators of the war, Joseph Chamberlain, Alfred Milner, and the military might of empire personified by Lord Kitchener, were all apparently going off balance. Chamberlain stated,
"The time's come, or is coming, where measures of greater severity may be necessary."
Milner replied to Chamberlain,
"I feel that the present moment, with the concentration camp scandal hanging over our heads, is, well, not a good time for measures of greater severity. Moreover, I greatly doubt whether, as things stand now, that anything will hasten the end of the war. We will just have to catch the remaining Boers. Nothing else will do."
And Kitchener, here at Melrose House, is military headquarters in Pretoria.
The Boers are quite impossible people to deal with. And the only way will be to wear them out by continually catching their men and rendering the country uninhabitable.
And a little later, his mind was, well...
Fighting to a finish in this country and with these people means extermination. And that is a very long and tiring business. If you think that someone else could do better out here, I hope you will not hesitate for one moment in replacing me.
and soon Milner appeared to be going right round the bend.
The theory that all the weaker Boer children being dead, the rate of death would fall off, is not so far borne out by the facts. I take it that the stronger Boer children must be dying now, and that they will all be dead by the spring of 1903. Only I shall not be there to see, as the continuance of the present state of affairs for another month or two will undoubtedly blow us all out of the water.
Soon after Emily Hobhouse's return to Great Britain, the number of deaths in the concentration camps in South Africa began to fall. She, Emily, had seen the danger of massive mortality before anyone else. She had gone personally to the suffering, and she had banged a very loud drum until it echoed and re-echoed around the world. Improvements were made, and the deaths decreased. All honor to the truly brave and compassionate
The Boer army, from both the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, were never destroyed by the British. At the end of almost 3 years, there were still about 20,000 fighting Boers on active service, albeit hungry and dressed in rags. The British Empire had sent a total of about 450,000 imperial soldiers against them. That is, getting on for 500,000.
But the Boer nation was seriously threatened with annihilation, genocide. And so the astonishing Boer leaders, President Steyn, President Burgers, who is now standing in for Creer, and the generals, Louis Botha, Jan Smuts, De la Rey, Christian de Wet, amongst others, rode into a place called Vereniging and faced the Lords Milner and Kitchener. And there they lay down their arms. And here, on the 31st of May, 1902, in Melrose House in Pretoria, they signed the Peace of Vereniging. Emily Hobhouse wrote a book about the Boer women and children who had suffered because of the war. It is a very careful labor of historical fact. She called it The Brunt of the War and Where It Fell. And her introduction to the book ended, "Their innocent histories ought to become fully known and widely understood, and so implant a hatred of war and a shrinking from its horrors, which shall issue in a ripened determination amongst the kingdoms of the world to settle future differences by methods more worthy of civilized men." And the dedication read, "To the women of South Africa, whose endurance of hardship, resignation in loss, independence under coercion, dignity in humiliation, patience through pain, and tranquility amidst death, kindled the reverent appreciation of the writer and has excited the sympathy of the world." And she stipulated that all royalties from the sale of the book should be paid to the refurnishing fund for the reconstruction of Boer homes.
Now that the war was finished, Emily was, at long last, no longer alone. As the Boer people turned to peace, they also turned to the woman who had worked for them. In their appalling national distress, it seemed that the entire nation reached out to the Englishwoman. It was an astonishing human phenomenon.
And so the Boer women, the Afrikaners, collected money to enable Emily to buy a cottage at St. Ives. From there, she could look out across the great Atlantic Ocean, joining her country to theirs. During August 1902, the three Boer generals, Louis Botha, De la Rey, and Christian de Wet, came to England to collect money for their destitute people. At their request, Emily was on the pilot boat that steamed to meet them at Southampton. During their journey to London, the gallant Boers sat on either side of Emily. To them, she represented the best spirit of Great Britain. And now they were wise enough to focus on that spirit, and that spirit alone.
Early in 1903, Emily returned to South Africa, and hiring a simple wagon and with a Boer ex-prisoner of war as her guide, she traveled vast distances visiting the wrecked farms and gathering meticulous notes of urgent needs, etc. General de Wet invited Emily to be a guest in what remained of his farmhouse. He then asked her to accompany him to the first people's gathering at the town of Heidelberg, a sort of national reunion. She was placed in a seat of honor, again amongst the Boer leaders, and General Botha introduced her to the vast Boer gathering. They cheered her.
And then Emily met Jan Smuts, and he asked her to honor him by staying in his house. Emily wrote a letter to her brother about Smuts. I wish you could meet him. He's so clever and cultivated and full of fun. And yet underneath, he's heartbroken at the loss of his country. I prophesy a great future for Smuts.
Returning to England, Emily formed the Boer Home Industries Aid Society. She raised money, returned to South Africa, and set up schools right across the two countries. Primarily, they wove cloth.
As the years went by, Emily worked through Jan Smuts to help the Boer people. She nagged him endlessly with good advice, and he patiently wrote to her as, "My dear friend."
But her health was deteriorating fast. She developed arthritis, and she suffered a heart attack. In the year 1913, the Boer people had constructed a monument at Bloemfontein dedicated to the memory of the women and children who had died in the concentration camps. Ex-President Steyn of the old Orange Free State, on behalf of the nation, came to an extraordinary decision. He invited the Englishwoman, Emily Hobhouse, to unveil it. Emily accepted the honor and sailed again for Africa. But now she was extremely ill and very weak. She traveled northward through the Cape towards Bloemfontein, but at Beaufort West, she was too weak to continue. Or she couldn't face the emotional ordeal, and very quietly turned away. But she had prepared a speech, and the words have survived.
Alongside the honor we pay the sainted dead, forgiveness must find a place. I have read that when Christ said, "Forgive your enemies," it is not only for the sake of the enemy he said so, but for one's own sake. Because love is more beautiful than hate. As your tribute to the dead, bury unforgiveness and bitterness at the foot of this monument forever.
Finally, the list of her serious illnesses extended beyond even her ability to override them, and during the spring of 1926, Emily wrote,
I have all my life looked forward so greatly to death. The rest, the peace, the greatness of it.
She gave clear instructions that she wished her body to be cremated and for what remained to be buried in South Africa. The Boers heard her request, and her ashes were taken down the southern seas and from Cape Town northward to Bloemfontein. And at the foot of the great memorial to the women and children, Emily was buried.
Only 5 people have been awarded this so significant honor. Amongst them, President Steyn, General Christian de Wet, and Miss Emily Hobhouse. Jan Smuts spoke over the grave. We stood alone in the world, friendless among the people. The smallest nations ranged against the mightiest empire in the world. Then one small hand
the hand of a woman was stretched out to us. At that darkest hour, when our entire race almost seemed doomed to extinction, she appeared as an angel, as a messenger from heaven. And strangest of all, she was an Englishwoman.